Welcome to Melbourne Conversations Visions for the CBD. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne. You can also subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversation events. The City of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. I'd personally like to acknowledge that as we talk about the future of our CBD today in Naarm, Melbourne, we must also recognise that we are doing so on unceded lands and continue the discussion of what it truly means to heal country beyond NAIDOC Week for a sustainable, healthy and thriving city. My name is Kirby Clark. I am your host for this Melbourne Conversations edition. I'm a CBD resident. I've lived in Melbourne for only 5 years and reside in the CBD exclusively during the pandemic, whilst we've been in and out of all these lockdowns. I'm also a spatial and graphic designer involved in the creation of events around the CBD, such as Melbourne Knowledge Week and Melbourne Fashion Week. I also skateboard and much to the dismay of security guards and probably the council, I spend a lot of my time waxing up curbs and ledges around the city and staring down pedestrians waiting for them to get out of my way so I can wall ride that architectural fragment sculpture outside the State Library. On top of that, I'm an interior design lecturer and facilitator of educational experiences at the intersection of sustainability and design. I'm joined by a fantastic panel with a diverse range of expertise today across design, planning and economics, storytelling, climate justice, and the arts, as we discuss ideas around the future of this city. Unfortunately, Tony is unwell and able to be a part of this discussion today. He sends his apologies and we send our well wishes straight back to him. But let's get cracking with an introduction from each of our wonderful panellists, starting with urban design consultant extraordinaire, Leanne Hoddle. Over to you, Leanne.
Great, thanks Kirby, and thanks for the invitation to participate today. So my name is Leanne Hoddle. I'm an urban designer. I run a practice called Hoddle & Co, which is a research and urban design consultancy. I also recently launched an initiative called Cities People Love, which is a collective of researchers who are connecting best research practice to industry and to the decision makers who do shape our city. And I've also been a resident of the city. I've been living in the CBD for 15 years.
Fantastic. Thanks, Leanne. Over to you, Marcus. If you could give us a quick introduction about yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Marcus Spiller. I'm a principal and partner with SGS Economics and Planning, a consulting firm that advises governments and other parties on urban management. I've got more than 40 years experience in this trade. I'm born and raised in Melbourne, in fact born to Italian migrants, and I've seen Carlton, where I grew up, change from a downtrodden suburb to the much sought after place that it is, and always within sight of the CBD. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today.
Fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the insights that you've gained over this past 40 plus years. Amazing. And last but not least, we have Khalid. If you could just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Khalid. I'm a artist and writer. I live in Melbourne. I have an arts practice in Melbourne. I've been, I think most of my stories, except for one, have been set in Melbourne. So I guess that's something I have invested in the city, and I think I will continue to have that invested in the city. And I that's who I am.
Amazing, thanks, Khalid. As you can see, we have a really great range of diverse expertise, and I'm excited to hear all of the various insights around this topic. To get started, so as we know, CBD is traditionally an acronym for Central Business District. When I hear the term personally, I think, like glass and metal architecture, shops and corporate offices. But obviously CBD really goes beyond that. And the pandemic has really pushed us to question and reflect on the purpose and function of things that otherwise go unnoticed. So I'd like to get your point of view, starting with Leanne and then on to everyone else. What do you think a CBD is actually for?
Great, thanks, Kirby. Well, I think a CBD has many roles, and obviously Melbourne CBD has had many roles. It is absolutely the centre of trade and commerce of the city, but it also plays a role in all different other types of exchanges as well. So not just exchange of goods and finance, but actually exchange in its broadest sense. So we're including cultural exchange, the way we meet and gather, our social exchange, but also where we also politically exchange ideas and decision making occurs. So it's really an intensification of all of those layers of a city role. It's intensified at its greatest extent in the CBD. But I think it's also important that because it has all of those very many roles, that we think of the CBD as a place for everybody, so that everybody can access all of those activities.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic way of looking at it, beyond the commerce that it's driven by and representing all of the people within it. Marcus, what about yourself? What is a CBD for?
Yeah, well, look, I'd pick up the theme that Leanne's just set and say that the CBD is really a special piece of space for the Victorian and Melbourne community, because it is the space that we all share and we can all affiliate with. You know, whether you're from Mildura, Maribyrnong or Malvern, the CBD of Melbourne means something to you, even if you visit it once every 3 or 4 years, or even if you go in there every day of the week, or even if you live there. It is at the heart of our community and hosts the flagship institutions that we've collectively invested in, like, for example, the NGV and ACME. It's the place that houses our governance institutions, as Leanne's pointed out. And it reflects, I think, in the way that we orchestrate those various investments and the way that we look after our CBD. I think one of its jobs is to communicate to all of us what we stand for.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Generally, people look to a CBD as representing everyone, and you sort of think about when you're traveling, you know, London's iconic for something, New York is iconic for something, Melbourne is obviously quite iconic as well for the arts, which is fantastic. Khalid, what about you? What do you think the purpose or the role of a CBD is?
Yeah, I think building on what Leanne and Marcus said, it really is just it's the engine room for our identity, of our idea of ourselves, and it's where we tell the stories of ourselves. We've got, when we think of ourselves as Victorians or Melburnians, or even in a larger sense, what the role of the city of Melbourne or the CBD has, it's where the stories are created. It's where, you know, my mind leaps to AFL immediately, because so many narratives in my life touch upon what happens in that building. Well, it's not a building; it's an open ground. But yeah, it's where we're both reflected, and where we also try to build a narrative as well. I have an idea of a city. The city of Melbourne has an idea of the city. Everyone on this panel has an idea of the city, and it's not that these ideas compete; they just all meet in the central place.
Yeah, a tapestry of all of our stories. I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. Marcus, you've been described as, quote, a big deal in the Australian planning industry. You've got over 40 years experience in general, and 30 years under your belt as the principal and partner at SGS Economics and Planning. And on top of that, you've been consulting, town planning, heavily involved in academia. I'm sure you've seen a lot of the city evolve and the CBD sort of priorities of the CBDs change throughout your life. What priorities do you think that the CBD reflects today?
Yeah, look, I think the priorities that we see in the city today reflect a rebuilding period, or a renaissance period, that Melbourne has gone through over the past 30 years. I can recall in the early 90s, I was a ministerial advisor at the time, but I can recall that 1,000 people a week were leaving Victoria for other parts of Australia because of the massive decline in our economy related to the decline in manufacturing in particular. Since that time, there's been a heavy focus on pivoting the economy, and central Melbourne has been at the heart of that. So it's been culturally driven, for sure. It's also been driven by the repositioning of central Melbourne as a place to live. But there's no doubt that the priority, I feel, to date has been on the knowledge economy and trying to build central Melbourne as a place for advanced business services, for specialised services in finance, brokerage of various sorts, design, and other, if you like, types of business that focus on abstract problem solving, not material making things, but actually solving problems. So we've had a very strong business focus in Melbourne, but up until now.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear your point of view on that, and also thinking about this long sort of rebuilding period. I wonder as well if this pandemic and us being forced to sort of pause and rethink about what our priorities are has sort of sped up or intensified that rebuilding period as well. Leanne, what do you think that our current CBD, what the priorities of our current CBD sort of reflect as a resident and also designer and researcher?
So I think they reflect the fact that our priorities change over time. That's a really big, important point that Marcus has made, is that actually what we prioritise has changed a lot over the last couple hundred years. And so in the last, say, 10 to 20 years, I think it reflects the incredible surge of investment and interest in the city and love for the city as well, and also, which is reflected in the number of residents that have moved into the city. There was obviously a key drive to get those residents there, which has been really successful. And so now I actually think the priorities that the city reflects is the sort of product of that success. So for many of us, we're lucky to live there. It's effectively a lifestyle choice. We get access to great places to go, to amazing restaurants, cafes, cultural events, and so on. And I think it reflects that, and you can see that on the skyline with, for example, high-rise towers going up, which are a lot of them very places of leisure as much as accommodation. So I think it reflects that real shift in the last 20 years. And that also includes, for example, the attraction of international students who've really shaped the city in a really positive way, I think, in terms of its character and the different experiences of the city.
Yeah, definitely. And I hate to keep bringing up lockdown, but I mean, hey, it's all at the forefront of our brains at the moment, always staring us in the face. But yeah, it's definitely interesting seeing the lack now of international students and international workers in the CBD, and how that has actually changed the landscape of the CBD as well.
It's quite drastic.
A lot of empty apartments. Yep. Yeah, quite drastic. And yeah, it is interesting, I think, to sort of see the priorities from my point of view, having only lived in the CBD throughout the pandemic. I think the priorities sort of, we can think about things that are lacking, but also things that are focused upon. I think about sort of the neighbours that I see every day that don't have a roof over their heads and sort of sleeping in the streets. I think that there's an overwhelming amount of people that are currently in this situation with little to no support, and huge amounts of people now lining up at food banks. I think people experiencing homelessness are often sort of overlooked when considered what's important and what's a priority for the CBD, but really they're the residents that rely on the CBD more than most, and really should be a part of that conversation, should be prioritised. So on one hand, I think that, you know, when you see a sneaker store or someone walking into a sneaker store in the CBD and buying $300 sneakers, and then, you know, that could feed someone or 60 people breakfast, you sort of see that consumerism side of things being prioritised. But I guess on the other hand, as well, seeing empty shop fronts featuring artworks from local artists, and seeing City of Melbourne having all this art funding and grants, and having seen Rising, which was still good to sort of go and see some of these things if you're in the city, to go and watch the interactive components of Rising, even though we were in lockdown still. But I think that is definitely seen as a priority, more of the culture and the arts side of things, of the CBD. Khalid, I would love also. Oh, sorry, Leanne.
No, I was just going to comment on what you said, because I think more than anywhere else in our city, our CBDs are constantly remade. And so there's layers and layers of priorities that sort of get reflected on top of each other. And unfortunately, sometimes a new priority actually pushes something out, which I think is what we're seeing now too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight, definitely. Khalid, I'd love to hear your view on this as well, what you think our CBD currently prioritises.
Well, currently like right now, my mind immediately turns to the city reflecting our larger border policy, because of the specific situation that we're in, right? But in the long run, I think I've been trying to figure out what a relationship with the city can be for an individual and the community, and the differences between those two. And I think there's a focus on individual experiences in the city, but as a community of people, I think it's really our link to deep time. It's sort of like, I think something Leanne said about the city reflecting our previous priorities as well. It really just is that, isn't it? It's an accumulation of everything that we tried, and often we can see it in Kirby. You're talking about homelessness in the city being a visible reminder that our society is often really cruel to people that have a place there in it too. And I think that's why it's strange now talking about the pandemic situation, because I'm seeing the city reflect us in terms of the built environment, and I see where it's trending towards and where it's been and how things are moving, but I don't really get the sense of reflection of that in a more, there's no communal experience right now happening in the city. I think Rising was the last one that I was aware of that I was an anti-communal experience, because there was a build-up. I didn't get to see anybody, and nobody really got to be together. I don't know what the city reflects like that, but it reflects something.
Feeling you on that one, and it is a confusing time, especially unpacking these ideas in such volatile situations. But I think it is a great insight in that, it can represent and reflect the best and the worst of what we have going on in our community at the moment. But let's jump from the present to future framing. And I would really like to invite you all to share your visions of what a best possible future CBD would be. Khalid, as a creative and a writer that has this fantastic ability to paint a picture of the imagination so eloquently with your words, what do you see in the best possible CBD future?
I don't know. You're very kind, Kirby. And describing me that way. I don't know. I think for a while I've been interested in breaking down the distinction between the built world and the human world, and the idea of there being no real delineation between things like environment and weather and the insides of our body and our biological processes, and it less existing on a continuum and more existing on a big soup where everything sort of is hanging around. I think I'd like to see cities reflect that a little bit more. I'd like to see cities be, I don't want to say less artificial, because I do really think buildings and structures and concrete, I think that all has its place. I'd like to see a more fractal looking city. I think it's sort of touching on the polycentric model that Marcus was talking about earlier, I guess we'll talk about later. I'd like to see a city existing in a lot of different places at once. And I'd like to step outside and be in the wilderness. And I'd like to have a simultaneous experience of being safe, secure, healthy, happy in ways that I don't really think I know right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Safe, healthy, happy. Unfortunately, GDP is like our current ultimate measure of success, isn't it? So that really doesn't account for those sort of externalities, such as biodegradation or poor health of our communities. I think donut economics, if anyone's heard of it, I'm sure you have, is a really interesting approach to sort of future redesigning of cities and focusing more on allowing community to thrive and living within planetary bounds than actual production and consumption, which can lend to a really interesting and beautiful future city landscape. Leanne, what about yourself? What do you want to see in a best possible CBD future?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this this type of question in the last few days, and I was thinking about what I love about the city and what we don't want to lose, as well as what we want to see in the future. And I was thinking about the little area near where I live, where in 100 metres of the city, so one short block on Swanston Street, you have this incredible diversity of places to participate in the city. So there's, in a very short period, there's obviously shops, but they sell things like, bags that are made in Australia, but also international things. You've got a crepe store, you can go and buy crepes. Then you've got a doorway, which is to a historic building that houses some of the city's best jewellers, and they're actually making and producing things in there. You've got a university, you've got a nightclub, you've got just normal convenience things like a chemist and dentist. And this is just in a 1-minute walk of the city. It's incredibly rich. And I think I was reflecting on why that's possible. And part of it is a question of scale. They're all very small, layers and layers of smaller, more intimate spaces that actually people can take advantage of and actually create something in their little piece of the city. And it all adds up together to be almost a fractal thing that you're sort of suggesting, Khalid. So I would love to see a city where we keep that sense of richness and diversity and small scale, which I think, and affordability too, for a lot of those smaller places is key. It actually means that those sort of places can people can have a go. They can actually have an idea and actually experiment and try something in the city, which is why so many people are attracted to the city. So I'd love to see a city where that continues, where we get spaces not just to consume, but to make and to experience music, culture, ideas. And that's much, much harder as the things in the city that we build get bigger and bigger and bigger. It actually means that they're run by bigger organisations or bigger companies or corporates or whatever. So somehow we need to keep the small scale in the city, and that gives those people those opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. I'm smiling just envisaging that future, and also thinking about all of the empty shop fronts and empty offices that are left now that make way for spaces like this. Marcus, what about yourself? What do you see in a best sort of possible future CBD? And maybe you can also touch on what a polycentric CBD is as well, and whether that's a good option for us.
Sure. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that we should be enthusiastic, bold and ambitious about, the best future for our CBD. My experience and my journey so far has taught me that, the people can make a massive difference to the CBD or to any other part of the city if they put their minds to it and they really want it. And, the City of Melbourne reshaped central Melbourne in the mid-1980s when it brought in its then groundbreaking strategic plan, its postcode 3000 program, which repopulated the city and literally remade it. So dramatic changes are possible if we want to make them. So what kind of changes do we want to make? Look, I agree with what's been said already, that we do need a city that's more humanised. We do need a city that's greener. I think we need a city that speaks in a very practical and literal sense about its First Nations origins, the landscape that is. I think we need to make it more of a community, more of a living community with the full spectrum of our society represented. We need at least 15% permanent affordable housing, social housing in the central city, for example. In terms of your question there about a polycentric city, I do see the CBD as being always the first amongst equals across the major centres in our metropolis. And the reason for that is it is at the hub of the labour market. It will always be capable of doing specialised things that the other centres in suburban Melbourne won't be able to do. And that's not a criticism, that's just the fact that if you're a highly specialised business, the best place for you to be really is the central city, because that's where you can get the skills to power your business. But beyond that, I see plenty of opportunity, particularly in this post-COVID environment, where we know we can work from home, and we know that technology like this sometimes works. It will be more possible for businesses to move into suburban key centres like your Box Hills, like your Dandenongs, like your Footscrays and so forth. And that will even out opportunities for us, and I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, definitely. So am I. I think also just thinking back to when we had this initial chat a few weeks ago, and unfortunately with Tony not being able to be here, but thinking about some of the things that he said as well that we've already touched on, but like bringing back more greenery to the city, and that itself lends itself to this community and more ownership over spaces as well. And also thinking about how we can restore the wetlands and what we do along the Yarra River, or what's known as the Birrarong. And it's a difficult dance, I guess, but I shouldn't say difficult, but more complex. It's like allowing all of these complexities to be intertwined in the design and shaping of our future city.
Which
Leanne,
I think is
something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you've captured that really beautifully. And I think what we have to bring to that is actually a sort of intentionality. Like, what exactly do we want to create as this collective endeavour, which the city is? And it has to be a broader conversation than just commerce and trade. It has to be about community and inclusivity and biodiversity and culture, and so many layers of the city that too easily can be forgotten.
100%. On that note, I'm really looking forward to continuing on these conversations with experts like yourselves, and also within my own community too, and back and forth with the City of Melbourne as we continue to work on events that sort of shape the city too. But that's all we have time for today, and I really wanted to thank you so much for joining me and providing such really fantastic insights from a diverse range of backgrounds. If you're watching online, don't forget to subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. There's also a link in the video chat to a survey. The City of Melbourne team would love to hear your thoughts on the event, and to those of you that are here in person that we're talking to, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really great getting your insights on this all. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.